Welcome to this series of videos where we look at the introduction to music fundamentals. The first few videos concentrated on notating musical rhythm. Now we move to something slightly different, that is notating pitch. Eventually we'll put the two together so that you can see how you can notate pitch and rhythm simultaneously. Now, I've said before, probably in your classes and in some of the other videos, that music is very much like a language. And we'll see that directly now. Music has an alphabet, but it's thankfully a very short one. It has only 7 letters: A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. But these letters work in a very specific way. So let's have a look at the slide now, where you'll see 3 cycles of that alphabet. So once you've got to the letter G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, the cycle starts over again. And you start with A, go through to G, and then another cycle starting with A begins. You can have these cycles indefinitely, but what they represent is something quite interesting, and which I'm going to demonstrate to you in a few minutes. Let's have a look at how the alphabet is represented on a piano. On the slide in front of you now is a small picture of a piano keyboard, or just a small section of the piano keyboard. And you'll see that it consists of white notes and black notes. And you'll see that I've labeled all of them for you so that you can see which notes are which. At the moment, we're only dealing with the white notes. We'll get to the black notes a little bit later. So if you have a look at the bottom, the first note that we see is C, followed by D, E, F, and G. And then you see it starts again. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then again A and B. So those are the white notes of the piano and how they work. But what is this principle of starting all over again once we get to the end of the alphabet? Every time we get to G, we go back to A. Does that mean that every A that we come to is exactly the same? And that would be a very good question. All of the A's on a piano keyboard, or any A's that you sing, share a very similar quality, but you'll begin to learn about something called an octave relationship. Let's have a look at how that can be demonstrated. Here is a picture of a staircase, and at the bottom of the staircase is an A, and you see they go up by step: A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. And if you look very carefully, you'll see there is an empty space at the bottom with a question mark in it. If you think carefully, what is just before A? If we've got to A, what should be just before it in the musical alphabet in those steps? Your answer should be G. So you'll see that once you get to 1G, you step up to an A, then to a B, then to a C, D, E, F, G. The next A is much higher than the previous A that we started with. So in looking at it like a staircase, you can actually see that the A's are not exactly the same. One A is much higher than the other A. Let me sing you 2 notes to demonstrate that now. Here is one note, La. Here is the same note, 8 notes higher, La, La, La. They are the same note, but there are 7 notes in between. La, 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 la. So we call this an octave, going from one letter name to the same letter name above it or below it. Here we can represent it as an example. So there I've written for you 2 cycles of the musical alphabet. And I've written an arrow above a C and then an arrow above the next C and numbered them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So the distance between one C, and the next C is 8 notes. La, 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 la. And of course we could go an octave lower than that, 8 notes lower than that, and 8 notes higher than that. In fact, on the piano you can do that very easily, but with a voice we have limited capacity. So when you see one note like C or D, and you see the next D above it in those cycles of notes, that is called an octave relationship. They share qualities of sound. They sound the same, but one is higher and one is lower. Now let's go back to that musical alphabet on the piano. Originally I said that we were only dealing with the white notes. But there are black notes as well, and you'll see if you look at the slide carefully that the black notes come in patterns. They're patterns of 2 and 3 and 2 and 3. We can use these patterns to determine where the notes are on the keyboard. So if you're just sitting at a keyboard, of course, no keyboard will have all of the notes written on them. You've just got to be able to find them. So I'm going to show you a method, an easy method of locating the letter C on any keyboard or any C on any keyboard. Take a look at the keyboard now on your screen and look for any of the patterns of 2 black notes. Find the 2 black notes, any of the patterns of 2. And to the left of the 2 notes, you'll see that the white note directly to the left is C. It's always like that. So whenever you can find the pattern of 2 black notes, to the far left-hand side, you will find the note C. Once you've found C, you can find all of the other notes around it. So the white note just before C, where there's no black note in between, is B. And the white note before B is A, and so on and so forth. So once you've found C, you can find any of the notes. Just remember, you're looking for the pattern of 2 black notes and the far left of those 2 black notes. Here's a picture of what I actually mean. So you'll see that I've written 2 above the pattern of 2 and 3 above the pattern of 3. And then if you look to the far left, you'll see I've written a C under all of the C's that we've got in that picture. Now, we've spoken about the 7 letters in the alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. And we've seen how we can write those out as letters. But how do we write them in music? This is where something which you've probably seen many times before is going to come into play. We're going to learn about something called the stave or the staff. Both of those names mean the same thing, stave or staff. And you may have heard that this type of notation is called staff notation. This is where that name comes from. If you look at the slide, you'll see that a stave or a staff is actually 5 parallel lines. 5 parallel lines. Without anything as they are now in that picture, those 5 lines mean absolutely nothing. But we'll come to how we can give them meaning in a minute. If we look at those lines, there are 5 lines, and if you're looking at the slide now, you'll see that I've numbered them from the bottom. The first line is number 1, then it goes to 2, 3, 4, and 5. But there aren't only lines, there are spaces as well. And so there are 4 spaces in between the lines, which are equally important. You'll see I've also numbered them from the bottom. So the first space is 1, then 2, 3, and 4. But if you look in the picture just below the ones with the numbers, you'll see that there are big notes written on those lines and spaces. Those are semibriefs. You'll see that I've put a semibrief on each of the lines, but that in the second picture, I've also put in red a space below where there's no line, so the bottom space in the where the note is red, and a space right at the top where there's no line above it. So in fact, there are actually 6 spaces that we can represent on the stave. 5 lines and 6 spaces. This is important to know because in a few moments we're going to learn what each line can mean. Now I've said to you, the lines and the spaces on their own mean absolutely nothing. We need to give them some type of meaning so that we can give each line and each space a musical note. And this is where some very recognizable symbols come into play. On your screen now, you'll see 3 symbols which are called clefs. These are the 3 clefs that we use most often, and in fact the ones that we are going to learn to use in this course are the first 2. The first one is called the bass clef, the second one is called the treble clef, and the one on the far right hand side is called a C clef. We're not going to be learning about that clef in this particular class because we don't use it so much in notational devices for what you'll be doing in class. Let's look at the treble clef first. For those of you who have been to school and learnt about cursive, any type of cursive, you'll know that a capital G in cursive is like what you're seeing on your screen now. The treble clef is actually just a corrupted form of the cursive G. It just makes it look as though it's slightly more ornate, but it's actually meaning a G. What the G clef tells us is that when you put that at the beginning of the 5 lines, or the stave, at the beginning of the stave, the second line from the bottom is the note G. So let's just remember that again. When you have a treble clef at the beginning of a stave, the second line from the bottom, remember in that first picture I showed you, I numbered the lines from the bottom. So the second line from the bottom represents the note G. If we are to think about that carefully, G is the last letter of the musical alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So the space just underneath the G line, or the first space, would be an F. And the space just above the G line will be the beginning of the musical alphabet, A. So the second line of the 5 lines is G. The space just before the G is F. And the space just after the G is A. From there you can work out all of the notes up and down the stave. Let's have a look at them now. I've labeled them for you carefully. Look at the treble clef with all of the lines represented. The first line is E. The second line, as I've told you, is G. The third line, B. The fourth line, D. And the top line is F. If we look at the second picture at the bottom, the spaces are F, A, C, and E. You'll see that octave relationship now between the 2 pictures. If you look at the first picture, at the very top, the top line is an F, and in the second picture, the very first note in the first space is also an F, but they're not exactly the same F. They are an octave apart. One is lower than the other one. Now there is a clever little rhyme just so that you can remember what each of the lines is. Every good boy deserves food. So the first line, every. The second line, good. The third line, boy. The fourth line, deserves. And the fifth line, food. If you look at your hand like that, you can get the 5 lines of the stave. And the spaces, F, A, C, E. They spell face. Let's look at the bass clef now. And again, we have to turn to cursive or cursive writing to see what the symbol is now, how it was derived. So you'll see on your screen now a cursive F. And next to it, you'll see what we have now called the bass clef. What happened to the bass clef is that the 2 lines, the 2 parallel lines of the F, got detached from the actual F itself. So those are the 2 dots. if you drew lines from those 2 dots to the main part of the F, you'd see that it was actually an F. But for some reason, over many years, the 2 parallel lines got detached from the actual F part, and now they're just 2 dots. If we put this on the 5 lines of the stave, they're the 5 lines of the stave, the bass clef comes over them, and the 2 dots surround the 4th line. 1, 2, 3, 4. The 2 dots come over here. The line that is in between the 2 dots is F. So when you have the bass clef, the 4th line from the bottom, 1, 2, 3, 4, represents the note F. In the musical alphabet, if we go one higher than F, which is G, that would come in the space. So the space just above the 4th line is G. And the space just below that is an E. E, F, G. Once you've worked that out, you can work out all of the notes of the bass clef. Let's have a look at them. The bottom line is a G. The second line is a B. The third line is D. The 4th line, F. And the 5th line, A. G, B, D, F, A. And the 4 spaces are A, C, E, and G. A, C, E, and G. Now we've also got rhymes for these just to make it a little bit easier. Good boys deserve food always, and all cows eat grass. Again, we can see the octave relationship. If we go back to the bass clef, the first picture, you can see a G at the beginning. And you can also see in the second picture a G at the top of the last, A, C, E, and G. So the bottom line is a G and the top space is a G. That also represents an octave relationship. Now, we can put the treble clef and the bass clef together on something what we call the grand stave. We use the 2 staves together when we want to write piano music or anything for keyboard where you're going to use both hands. The treble clef we usually use for the right hand because it's the higher notes. The bass clef for the left hand because usually that's where the lower notes are written. Remember, bass clef is for things that are low. Treble is a word for little boys who can sing high. So a boy that can sing high is called a treble rather than a soprano. Usually we call people or women who can sing up high sopranos. There is something called a soprano clef, but you don't need to learn about that. The treble clef is another word for boys who can sing high. So you can have treble meaning high notes and bass meaning low notes. And usually your left hand plays the low notes and your right hand the high notes. So when you're trying to write notes that are higher up on the piano, you're going to use the treble clef. When you're going to use lower notes, you're going to use the bass clef. If you look at this picture now of the grand stave, you'll see all of the lines have been labeled, just as we've learned already. In the bass clef, G, B, D, F, and A. In the treble clef, E, G, B, D, and F. But you'll see also that there is a red line between the 2 staves where there is a C. Now this is a very special note. It's called middle C. You don't actually write it right in the middle there as in this picture. But if you are writing a semibreve, for example, you'd write a semibreve and a small line right in the middle of it, just below the treble clef or just above the bass clef. What this shows us, though, is that if you write middle C in the bass clef, it's right at the top of the clef, which means that most of the notes are going to be lower than middle C. But in the treble clef, the middle C comes right at the bottom of the clef, so that means everything else is going to be much higher than middle C. But we write the note the same way. a note with a little line bisecting it or going right through the middle of it. Let's come back now to the piano keyboard. I want you to look at starting at the very beginning of the piano keyboard on the letter C. And I've taught you how to find C, but thankfully we've labeled the notes here. And I want you to count both the black and the white notes from C all the way through to B, right through an octave, okay? See how many notes you come up with. Pause the video now, do that, and then we'll come up with the answer. Hopefully you will have come up with the answer 12. If we count all of the letters of the alphabet, C, D, E, F, G, A, and B, we get a total of 7. And if we add the 5 black notes as well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we get a total of 12 notes. You may be thinking, well, this is a problem. And indeed it is, because we only have 7 letter names, but we have 12 notes. So what are we going to do? Well, this is where we come up with something called accidentals. And that is what we are going to do in the next video.